Did you know that before it was the United States, America was just a fragile strip of coastline, a place where half of the first settlers didn't even survive their first year? How did a bunch of struggling colonies, clinging to the edge of a vast, unknown continent, manage to defy the world's greatest empire? And what does a plant, a ship, and a cup of tea have to do with the birth of a nation? This isn't just a history lesson. It's a story of survival, rebellion, and the incredible birth of an idea that would change the world forever. Let's dive right in and uncover the epic tale of colonial America. So, where does this incredible story begin? Picture this. It's 1607. A group of 104 Englishmen land in a swampy, humid part of Virginia. They call it Jamestown. This wasn't some grand beginning. It was a disaster waiting to happen. The climate was brutal, malaria was rampant, and food was so scarce that they faced a period known as the starving time. Within a year, dozens were dead. I mean, can you even imagine the desperation? It really looked like the American dream was over before it even started. But then, something unexpected saved them. A plant. A man named John Rolfe figured out how to grow a sweeter, more popular type of tobacco. Suddenly, Virginia had brown gold. The colony wasn't just surviving anymore, it was booming. It's wild to think that a simple cash crop basically rescued the first English foothold in America. Now, let's jump forward just over a decade to 1620. Have you ever heard of the Pilgrims? This group of religious separatists, wanting to break away from the Church of England, boarded a ship called the Mayflower, searching for a place to practice their faith freely. They landed way off course, in what is now Massachusetts, and founded Plymouth Colony. But before they even set foot on land, they did something truly revolutionary. They drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact. Why is this so important? Because it was the first agreement for self-government ever written in America. It's like the tiny seed from which American democracy would one day grow. Their journey, however, was just as brutal as Jamestown's. That first winter was devastating. Half of them perished from cold, hunger, and disease. But they received help from the local Wampanoag people, who taught them how to plant corn and survive the harsh New England environment. The next fall, in 1621, the survivors and their Native American allies shared a harvest feast. We now call it the First Thanksgiving. It's a moment of cooperation and gratitude that has become a cornerstone of the American story, though the relationship that followed is far more complicated. So, with Jamestown in the south and Plymouth in the north, what happened next? Well, throughout the 1600s, more and more colonies started popping up along the Atlantic coast, eventually forming the famous 13. But here's what's fascinating. They weren't all the same. They developed into three distinct regions. Up north, you had New England. Think Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. The soil was rocky and tough for farming, so they turned to the sea. They became masters of fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. Then you have the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. These were the jackpot for farming. With fertile soil, they became known as the breadbasket colonies, growing tons of grain. I find this region particularly interesting because it was a real melting pot, with Dutch, German, and Irish settlers, making it incredibly diverse from the very beginning. Finally, there were the southern colonies, like Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. The warm climate was perfect for massive plantations growing cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. But this agricultural wealth came at a terrible, inhuman cost. The entire economy was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, a dark foundation that would lead to centuries of conflict and pain. This expansion wasn't peaceful either. As settlers pushed westward, they clashed violently with Native American tribes who were defending their ancestral lands. Conflicts like the Pequot War and King Philip's War were incredibly bloody and resulted in the devastating loss of life, land, and freedom for Native peoples. As we move into the 1700s, do you ever wonder what daily life was actually like? Well, these colonies were starting to feel less like remote English outposts and more like unique societies. Religion was a huge part of people's identity. In New England, the Puritans created a very strict community-focused society. In Pennsylvania, the Quakers championed ideals of peace, equality, and religious tolerance, which was quite radical for the time. And politically, something amazing was happening. Even though they were technically under the thumb of the British king, most colonies had their own local governments, called colonial assemblies. People were getting a taste for making their own rules and electing their own representatives. This spirit of self-government was quietly taking root. At the same time, the population was exploding. Waves of immigrants from Germany, Ireland, and Scotland arrived, bringing new skills, foods, and traditions, adding even more layers to the American identity. But while some people were arriving in search of freedom, hundreds of thousands of others were being brought in chains. The transatlantic slave trade, part of a brutal system called the triangular trade, forcibly brought Africans to the Americas. They were treated not as people, but as property, enduring unimaginable cruelty. It's a deep, painful scar on the nation's history, and you can't understand America without understanding this fundamental hypocrisy. So, if things were developing so well, what went wrong between the colonies and Britain? For a long time, the relationship was mostly beneficial, but a war changed everything. In 1754, the French and Indian War erupted. It was part of a larger global conflict between Britain and France. Colonists and British soldiers fought side by side, and after a long 9 years, they won, kicking France out of North America. You'd think this would bring them closer, right? Wrong. Victory came with a massive price tag, and the British government was drowning in debt. Their solution? Tax the American colonies. Suddenly, a wave of taxes was imposed by the British Parliament. The Sugar Act in 1764. The Stamp Act in 1765, which taxed everything from newspapers to playing cards. Then the Townshend Acts. Colonists were furious. Their argument was simple and powerful. No taxation without representation. They had no representatives in the British Parliament, so how could Parliament legally take their money? It felt like a fundamental violation of their rights as Englishmen. The tension just kept building, leading to protests and boycotts. The breaking point finally came in 1773 with the Tea Act. To protest, a group of patriots in Boston, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. This act, known as the Boston Tea Party, was a bold, unmistakable message of defiance. There was no turning back. The Boston Tea Party lit a fuse. How did Britain respond? With absolute fury. In response, Parliament passed a series of laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, which shut down Boston's port and stripped Massachusetts of its self-government. This was meant to punish them into submission, but it had the opposite effect. It united the colonies. In 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They weren't calling for independence just yet, but the conversation had started. Then, on a fateful morning in April 1775, British troops marched to Lexington and Concord to seize colonial weapons. A militia of local farmers and artisans stood in their way. A shot was fired. To this day, no one knows by which side, and it became the shot heard round the world. The American Revolution had begun. Soon after, the Second Continental Congress convened. They formed a Continental Army and made a brilliant choice for its commander, a Virginian named George Washington. For over a year, they fought while still debating their ultimate goal. But inspired by thinkers like Thomas Paine, the idea of complete independence caught fire. Finally, on July 4, 1776, the delegates in Philadelphia took the ultimate leap. They adopted the Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson. With this document, they didn't just break from Britain. They declared the birth of a new nation founded on a radical idea, that all men are created equal, with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, after nearly 170 years, the colonial era came to a dramatic close, giving way to a revolution and the birth of the United States. Let's just quickly recap the incredible journey we've seen. We saw how fragile beginnings at Jamestown were saved by a tobacco plant. We saw how the Pilgrims' quest for religious freedom led to the Mayflower Compact, a blueprint for self-rule. And most importantly, we saw how taxes and a fight over representation ignited a rebellion against an empire leading to the Declaration of Independence. The legacy of this era is everything. It gave America its relentless spirit of liberty, its foundational dream of democracy, and its complex identity as a nation of immigrants struggling with a history of profound injustice. From a few starving settlers to a nation declaring its independence, the colonial period wasn't just the beginning of a country. It was the dawn of a new experiment in human freedom. What do you find most surprising about this era? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey back in time, please hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next historical adventure. Thanks for watching.